Hello, and welcome to The Resource, the podcast propelling employer brands to recruit smarter and retain better. I'm your host, Priscilla Peters.
And I'm your other host, Scott Dismuke. And Priscilla, we're smack dab in the middle of summer. It's hot, it's humid, but we got a lot going on, both within the world of trucking and outside the world of trucking. We just finished the 4th of July. We got the World Cup going on. Like, where's your head at with all this stuff?
Listen, I'm here for it. I'm here because this to me are the dark days of, if you're a sports fan, normally July is not fun unless you're baseball. I know you're a baseball fan. I am too, but not like I am football, basketball. But listen, this whole World Cup business, I'm here for
Yes.
it.
Yeah. So let's talk about that because I'm not a big, soccer, we call it soccer here. It's football
Yeah.
everywhere else. But I did go, my wife and I went earlier this year with some friends to a Nashville SC soccer game here. And it was so much fun. It's a lot like hockey. It's so much better in person. It can be a little, I don't want to say boring, but it can be a little lethargic maybe when you watch it on TV. But in person, man, just the atmosphere and the crowd, and it was a lot of fun. I have gotten into the whole World Cup thing. I would say probably my interest has waned a little bit since the U.S. lost. My wife is not into it one bit. I was watching it this past weekend and and my wife's not a big television watcher. She usually just watches what we have on. But she was like, I am so done with soccer. I don't want to watch any more soccer. The U.S. is out. Like, turn the channel. So that's where she's at.
I will say, well, here's some things I've learned from the World Cup. Number one is I underestimated that the fans were as just savage and amazing as they are. Number two, I know where Lane Kiffin got the fake an injury and fall down and flop and act like you got hurt. Like, I'm like, Lane Kiffin just took a note out of from World Cup soccer.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, am I wrong? Like the way they dramatically flop around and half the time no one even touches them is the most, I love it so much. It just cracks me up. And then number three, I would just say we have an office in the UK and it has been fun to talk to our folks over there and they are still in it.
They're still in it.
England is still in it.
Yeah,
And
that's
I
probably
mean, I
who
don't know
I'm
if they're
rooting
working
for.
this week,
Yeah. Yeah,
but
that's
they are very
probably,
excited. They're very
yeah.
excited.
I was having a conversation with somebody about like the importance of the World Cup and why it's such a big deal outside of the US. And they made the analogy to me. Imagine if the Super Bowl for the NFL was only played every 4 years
Yeah.
and how crazy Americans would go for the Super Bowl being played every 4 years. That's kind of the analogy that they use. I'm like, okay, I get that. I get that. But listen, I would have loved to have gone to kind of experience. I would probably wouldn't go. I would love to go to a U.S. game, but I just don't know. I'm like, is it ever going to be a big sport for us? Like, I just seem like we get to the same place in the World Cup every year and then we lose. And you see when we go up against top tier teams, just really how far superior they are to our soccer. So I don't know. I think it'd be crazy if, we could get beyond the round of 16, but that kind of seems to be our ceiling these days.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been fun. I think it's been a good like distraction from the dog days of summer over here in the US. So
Yeah, it had. And I tell you what's really been fun is watching the reaction of people from across the globe coming to the US. I think we get somewhat of a bad rap, us crazy Americans. I think we get so much of a bad rap, but I think a lot of folks from the world have come over and seen how we indulge here in America. Like one of the big thing I saw people talk about free refills and just the craziness of the food here in America. It's
yeah,
been interesting
someone
to see
told
what the
me
world thinks.
I have seen they were talking about to go boxes. Apparently, like if you eat in other countries, you eat in a restaurant, like to go box isn't a thing. And we're like, I mean, you go to Olive Garden, you can get your meal and another meal in a to go box. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know if we should be proud of that or not, but but it's something that they're like, this is weird. You take what's left in a box and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, there's a reason why folks in the U.S. our size is a little bit
Yeah.
different than folks
Yeah.
from Europe. And I think what you just said is, I mean, I wonder how many all-you-can-eat buffets they have over in Europe. Probably,
Probably not
probably not,
many.
not many.
Mm-mm.
So, well, I tell you what, kind of tie into this before we get into some of the retention stuff we're going to talk about today. We're going to hit our final mile first five, but obviously we're going to do things a little differently than we normally do since we don't have a guest today. So, would you be ready to hit the final mile first five?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So here's the question, kind of tagging on to what we just talked about. In honor of our World Cup tourists that have come over here to the good old USA, is ranch the greatest condiment ever invented?
Okay, so I literally saw this on our little outline this morning, and I have never considered ranch a condiment, like in my head until I saw this question. And then I'm like, because I always just think of it as a salad dressing. But to be honest, it probably is a condiment, I would
It's
say.
it's become one. I
It
think you're
yeah,
right. I
I
think it
mean,
yeah.
it's like it kind of goes in that category with honey mustard for me. Like it's technically a salad dressing, nowhere near as good as honey mustard. Let me be clear. Ranch deserves, but I will say if it's the right kind of ranch, it may be the best condiment ever. I mean, I was trying to think if I'm going to define the best condiment ever, I'm going to have to think about like what condiment do I want on almost everything? And being like a redneck from the South, normally ketchup would be my
Well,
go-to.
we're aligned here a little bit because if we're going to say ever invented,
Yeah.
then you got to. I mean, ketchup's been around for a really really long time. Now, if you want to talk about versatility, like
Yes.
ranch, like I'm not putting ketchup on my pizza.
I was literally about to say that. This is where I think ranch takes over and takes the first place spot because yeah, I'm not putting ketchup on my pizza. It is definitely a head to head with ketchup and ranch for me.
Yeah,
Um
yeah. I think
Followed
that
very closely by aioli, I would call it instead of mayonnaise.
aioli, yeah. But I think once you cross the Mason Dixon line, it becomes aioli. When you hit the May, it's all it's all mayonnaise. Um, no, I think you're right. I think you and I actually agree on this one. I think ketchup may be kind of boring. There are certain things that people put ketchup on, like people put ketchup on their scrambled eggs. I will never do that. I don't
Oh,
understand
I
that.
would totally do that.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. But yeah, I think ranch is far more versatile. I mean, ranch with buffalo wings. You put it on your, like I said, pizza, on a burger.
I mean, there's
There's
not
so
many
many
things I
things.
would use a condiment for that I wouldn't just say, well, just use ranch. Just when in
Yeah,
doubt, put some ranch on it.
I've got a nephew. I think he's 8, and that kid loves ranch on everything. Absolutely everything. If you can't dip it in ranch or pour ranch on it, he won't eat it. So,
Yeah, I
so
have a
yeah,
son that's like that. He's
yep.
he's like, "Where's the ranch?" And we can't when the kids were all here living here, we could not keep. I mean, I had to buy ranch every week, like a big thing of ranch because they would eat it on everything. So yeah, it's crazy. But listen, the world knows about ranch now.
It's no
That's for
longer
sure.
a here you go. It's no longer a hidden valley. There you go. We
Oh,
can tie a bow
okay.
on
Bada
this
bing. We'll
podcast
do some
right
kind of
now.
sound effect there.
Yeah. Sorry. That was way too easy. Way too easy.
Oh, love it. I
All
love
right.
it.
So let's kind of get into this. Obviously, this is going to be a little bbit of a different episode than what we normally do. But today we're going to dive into one of the biggest studies that we've done on our data here at PDA. We have been collecting data here for now going actually over 11 years from drivers, all over the spectrum. And one of the things that we started to want to get into is what does a data profile look like for drivers who have voluntarily quit? What does that tell us? Not just from the data overall standpoint, but you know, how long, when in their tenure does it matter? Like, how long does it take for them to, quit? Is it one issue? Is it multiple issues? There were just several things that we wanted to look into as it related to when they quit. We want to talk about that today, and there's several things that we want to go over on that. But we really wanted to look at what are some of the patterns that predict who's going to leave before they actually do. Because here's the one thing: if you look at the trucking industry, every aspect of a trucking company has visibility. And what I mean by that is your maintenance department gets visibility of trucks through diagnostics and other things. The finance department obviously has multiple spreadsheets, so they have visibility when it comes to making the decisions about finances. Operations has visibilities through their TMS, and recruiting has visibility through an ATS. But what's the one area that a trucking company has zero visibility on? And that is the drivers. They have no visibility on their drivers, on what they're thinking, what their feedback is. And that is one of the things that PDA is looking at doing, is giving companies visibility into their drivers. And now we're getting into, and depending on when this is dropped, we're getting ready to have a pretty big announcement on our ramp system that we've been using for the last several years and taking that to the next level. So there's a little bit of a teaser there. So we kind of want to walk through some of that today as it relates to the data that we have found in that.
Yeah. And I think what's fascinating about this, and I would caution any of our listeners or viewers, if you're like, oh, this is about retention, let me hop off because I'm over recruiting. This is not just a retention conversation. Like what came out of this, and even what you guys, the data that you have, and honestly, even the work that you do with the carriers that you work with, it impacts recruiting, it impacts onboarding, you know, orientation, operations, like you name it, it impacts almost every area of a trucking company and every touch point that the driver has. So I think that's really important to just kind of keep in mind. So let's kind of dive into this, Scott. When you first started and you guys decided, okay, we're going to do this analysis, like what were you hoping to find? Like what was kind of your goal there?
Well, a lot of it is kind of moving beyond your typical exit interview. So with an exit interview, it's purely reactionary, right? So you're finding out why a driver left after they've left, and that's good data. I mean, we do exit interviews for multiple companies, and it's still good data. But we've been able to see patterns that have formed over the last several years. And what we wanted to do is, what were those predictive indicators? And to be perfectly honest with you, and this is where we're going with the new ramp system that we're announcing, is we wanted to build an early warning system. We wanted to be able to look at those predictive indicators, to be able to tell companies that we're fortunate enough to work with to say, hey, you need to look at this driver. They may be telling you they're okay, but the data is telling a different story. And we had so much valuable feedback data that drivers have given us over the last 10 years that we saw the opportunity to say, okay, technology has improved to the point that we've got AI, and AI is great depending on how you're using it. But we were able to use AI to come in and give some predictive indicators, not only from a data standpoint, but actually where within the tenure a driver is experiencing an issue, and how that affects if a driver stays or if a driver leaves. So that is really the kind of the analysis that we were looking for and why we started it. So from a recruiting perspective, do you think, and I guess this is a little bit of a leading question, but do you think companies still view retention as something that starts months after orientation?
I think in some cases, maybe not months, but I think in some cases they think that, especially like on the recruiting side of things, they're like, I'm recruiting them. You got to keep them. Tends to be kind of the mindset with some folks. But I think I will say I think we've made some strides here. Being in the industry 27-ish years at this point, there was a time where recruiting and retention were so separate that the same people weren't even hardly in the room. today it doesn't feel like that as much. But I think, I mean, the big thing for me is like making folks need to understand that retention really starts the day you start recruiting them, because how you recruit them, what you tell them, all the things. And I know we'll dive into some of this as we're talking through this, but like it's critical. Your retention is going to hinge on how you recruit that driver from the jump. But I think we've made some headway here. I think if you, it would be interesting. You know, we're getting ready to do a carrier survey. It would be interesting to see from carriers, when do you think retention starts? I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud there, but I just think that like how they set their expectations, you know, making sure the drivers, and I know we're going to talk through all of this, and there's lots of soapboxes here I could get on, so I'm trying not to,
No,
but
go right. Yeah, go right ahead.
before we dive into all this, but I'm just saying, like, it's just this whole idea of what you sell from the jump to the driver is super critical. So I think it could be argued that retention starts the second recruiting starts.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because what we see in all of our data, not just this, but is where do those expectations meet the predictability? So the recruiting side of it obviously sets the expectations, and then obviously the operations side of it is fulfilling or not fulfilling in some cases what those expectations are, because ultimately it all goes back to the predictability, and that predictability is based upon what is sold to that driver in recruiting.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. So let's dive into some of it.
Okay, let's go. So if I asked you when most drivers voluntarily quit, like when in their tenure, what would your guess be? Like when is the biggest time?
Um, I would say 60 days ish would probably be my best
Yeah,
guess.
you're right. You're right in that. But let me kind of break this down for you into 30-day increments. Okay.
Okay.
The voluntary quit rate on our data in days 0 through 30 was 50.1%. So half of the voluntary quits that we analyzed in 10 years plus worth of data, 50% of them quit in the first 30 days. If you expand that out to days 31 to 60, so in the first 2 months, it's 68.9%. Then if you take it to 90 days, so the first 3 months of the drivers that voluntary quit that we were talking to, it goes up to 81.4%. So if you look at that 90-day window, 81% of the drivers quit in that 90-day window. So I
Wow.
think going to that previous conversation that we just talked about, where expectations meet predictability, you don't have a lot of time to match that up. And we're going to get into that here in a second, but you don't have a lot of time to make sure that the expectations are being met with 50% of those drivers leaving that quickly.
And I knew that number was high for 90 days. I don't know if I thought it would be as high as in the 80s. Like that to me is, I mean, don't get me wrong. We've, you know, that's kind of been a standard in the industry. I mean, good, bad, or ugly. We have to admit that as an industry. But to the tune of 80% is, I mean, and what gets me, Scott, is, and one of the things I'm learning is, and you guys probably are learning this more than even um we are, but like the effort and the investment and the attention that retention gets does not, it doesn't mirror that 80%. And I feel like they've tried, like as an industry, we've tried to recruit our way out of this. And we are realizing, and I think everyone is realizing, you cannot recruit your way out of a driver shortage, if that's what you want to call it, a challenging, you know, workforce, you know, talent pool situation, like however you want to define it. Not to get on any kind of debate about the driver shortage, but like the issues we have in hiring good labor for truck drivers cannot be fixed by just recruiting well. We have to be able to retain well as well. And I just think that that 80% just, woo, I mean, and to me, it's like, if I'm a fleet, I'm like, what can I do in that first 90 days? Like, how many hands do I have to hold to get them across that line? And so that's really interesting. So whenever people talk about turnover, compensation normally dominates that conversation. Is that what you saw your data? Did your data support that? What did that look like?
It supports it to a point. And so, we in PDA, we kind of break our feedback down into core issues. Now we get to the root cause of that when we're talking to drivers, but we break those down by, equipment, operations, home time, compensation, orientation training, personal issues, company issues, things like that. We try to break that down. And I'll tell you, most of the time, the three most dominant issues when it comes to feedback are equipment, compensation, and operations, which, I mean, if you think about it, makes a heck of a lot of sense. But when you look at a voluntary quit, there are issues that cause them actually more than compensation. Now, what I will say to that is I think going back to our earlier discussion, it's all kind of intertwined together. But let me give you an example. The number one issue that we saw with the highest voluntary quit rate were orientation and training issues. Now, if you look at pure volume of the feedback that we get, it's usually on the low end. But we were able to see out of 3,561 drivers that reported issues during orientation or issues with training or right after, the voluntary quit rate on those drivers was 41.3%. Now, it wasn't a pure volume issue. If you look at, say, equipment issues, we reported over 18,000 equipment issues.
Okay. So I want to make sure I'm understanding this right. So you're saying that if they had an issue with training and orientation, they were more likely to voluntarily leave
Correct.
than if they just had an equipment, not just, but if they had an equipment
No, understood.
issue or a compensation.
Yes.
Interesting. So in my mind, I'm like, that ticks them off more for whatever reason. Like that gets me, if I'm a driver, if something goes down that I don't love in orientation or training, then I'm like, I'm out.
Well, I think it also goes to show that in those first couple of weeks, particularly if you look at what we just talked about in the first 30 days, if you look at those first couple of weeks where expectations have been set by recruiting and they're not matched, guess who the driver blames? It's all about that orientation and training process. That's
That's a
going
good
back
point.
and
Yeah.
the fault is being laid at that. And it may or may not necessarily be the truth, but what it does tell us and the way that we're helping our customers with that now is we don't have tons and tons of drivers that report orientation training issues with us. But when they do, they're immediately red flagged with our customers and say, hey, you're going to have to keep an eye on this driver because the data tells us that almost half the drivers that report it end up voluntarily quitting.
That's so good. That's so good to know,
So
Scott.
that's super important to look at. We report equipment issues all the time and they're unbelievably important. So equipment issues, like I said, one of the largest as far as feedback volume issues we have, the voluntary quit rate on equipment issues is 35.7%. It's actually a little bit lower. Ironically, if you look at compensation, again, an extremely high volume, but the voluntary quit rate on that was 31.6%. It's 10% less than orientation and training. Now, 31.6% is still a lot, but it's actually below equipment and it's actually below operations. Operational issues have a 33.1%. Now, we're going to see here in a little bit how a combination of issues affects that, where I really think the compensation really plays its biggest role. But if you just look at it universally from a core issue standpoint, you're going to get a lot of volume feedback on those big issues. But if you look at the impact that those issues have, the biggest one is orientation and training.
Interesting. The weight of that is heavier.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
mean, even when you think about, like, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, even when
Yeah.
you think about from a just a relational standpoint, there are offenses my husband can make that are
Yeah.
more heavily weighted than others. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? I mean,
So kind of a two-parter to follow up on that with you. So given that orientation training, which obviously with your background and experience, you have a lot of information on, does it surprise you that those issues were higher than say compensation issues? I mean, what is that?
it does surprise me that, well, it surprises me that training and orientation were weighted that heavy, like they carried that much weight with the driver. Now, I'm not saying I don't think drivers think, orientation and training is important, but the more I think about it, it's not as surprising because think about it, the driver's away from home, in most cases not getting paid hardly anything during orientation. So if it stinks and the process is, wonky or whatever, then he's like, or she, they're just like, I'm here, I'm not getting paid anything to do all of this, and I could have done half this from home, or whatever that looks like. So I mean, the more I think about it, it's not surprising. What I'm trying to get my head around is I'm thinking so much like the way when we read your data, we're always like, oh, equipment compensation, like that's what I, and now it is interesting to think that, oh, when you look at this, just because the volume of the issue isn't high doesn't mean carriers shouldn't pay attention to it. Not that they're not paying attention to orientation and training, but you know what I mean? That to me is what is even more kind of eye opening in looking at all this.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So let me ask you this as it relates to that because I do think this goes back to the recruiting and the expectations game. Like how much of a role do you think first impressions, trust, confidence in the carrier, how much of that do you think plays a role in all of this?
Listen, I think trust with recruiters is number one. If a driver trusts your recruiters, that is huge. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, and this has been a long time. I'm aging us on this, but we did something where I think it may have been a driver survey. It was a driver survey that we did, and we said like, what do you like most about the recruiting process? What do you like least, or whatever? And the responses we got back, we ended up doing a word cloud of everything because we were like, we want to give a picture of what these drivers are saying. And at the end of the day, they were saying, we don't trust recruiters. And it was like, I don't trust you. Stop lying to me, da 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 da. So I think that and sometimes that means like, I always say to carriers, tell the truth. Even if your pay isn't the best, or your equipment might not be the best, or your orientation might not be the best, tell the truth. Like, say, hey, this is how much you get paid. Let's not say you're going to get paid up to this and it be some kind of crazy number that they're never going to be able to attain unless they've been there for 47 years and done this and that and checked all these. It's like, my thing is just be truthful, be realistic, even if you know it might not be the quote unquote best in the market. I think it goes a long way to be able to say, hey, I want to give you a real clear picture of what your experience is going to be here. And I'm not going to sell you an experience that isn't going to match that.
Yeah.
So for me, the trust above all those things that you mentioned is number one.
Right, which I think leads into the first impression, 100%.
Yes,
And so
yes.
two things I want to throw out for carriers that are listening to this. And you may disagree. If you do, that's totally fine. But I will tell you, in all the conversations that we have, I don't think, well, let me just tell you, there's one thing that drivers are thinking about in orientation, and that's getting out of orientation.
Right.
Now, because that's how they make money, right? So I do think it's very important that you run a very well-oiled orientation, and that that you do feed them and you're putting them in a nice place to stay. But ultimately, they care more. They, meaning the drivers, care more about what their first truck looks like than they do about what you fed them for lunch. It's important. I mean, you don't want to just throw some slop on a plate, But if you give them the best orientation experience that they've ever had, and then you put them in a dirty truck or a broken down truck the minute they leave orientation, all of the goodwill that you may have built up in orientation does not matter. It just doesn't. And so the orientation training experience is, as you can now tell, is extremely important, but it's all about first impressions and it's a package deal. It's like Priscilla said, it starts when they start having those conversations with recruiters. It leads into their experience in orientation, which no driver likes, no driver wants to be in. So it's got to be at least pleasant. And then it goes into putting them in a truck that's running on day one. That's all one big package deal. So, anyways, I just thought that was very interesting. And I was very interested in your take on the orientation training, because that was honestly, that was one of the things that surprised me the most in this report. The other favorite thing of this study for me wasn't just, what happened to a driver, but it was when it happened. And I'm really interested to get your feedback on this. So when it happened, we're talking tenure. Okay. So listen to this. If a driver had an equipment issue in the first 2 weeks of their tenure, their voluntary quit rate was 46.5%. If they had an issue in orientation training in the first 2 weeks, which obviously is when they were going to have it, would be 43.5%. Now, here's an interesting one, and I've got some follow up data on this that will put this in context. If they had a compensation issue in the first 2 weeks, the voluntary quit rate was only 29.5%. Okay. So now let's take it to a week further. If a driver had a compensation issue in week 3 and 4, the voluntary quit rate jumped up to 44.4%. So what does that tell us? If your driver has a compensation issue in the first 2 weeks, they see that more as maybe a one off. Like, I just came out of orientation. It's probably not typical for me to expect a 2,500-mile week that first week and maybe the second week, as I'm kind of getting used to that. So it could be a one off. But what that tells you is if you get to weeks 3 and 4 and that driver is still having those compensation issues, then it becomes a trend. This isn't just a one off, it's a trend. So almost half of the drivers that have that compensation issue in weeks 3 and 4 are out the door. So
Interesting.
so it's important when those issues happen. Again, first impression, going back to what we just talked about, if they have an equipment issue right off the bat, 46.5% of the drivers left.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, and I mean, and my thing is if I'm a carrier, I can go and look at this data and figure out like almost kind of goals for the first 2 weeks. We got to get these things right. We cannot mess up on these you know what I mean? Like, and kind of track even individually from the data that you guys, if I was a carrier that you guys would have for me. That's very interesting. Another thing, and you brought this up earlier, and I'm dying to hear about it, is what jumped out at me that you said earlier is that drivers sometimes don't just quit over one issue. Like, my gut tells me that, and you kind of hinted at this, but I could be wrong, is that compensation isn't necessarily like the big culprit overall, but like when you put compensation with equipment or compensation with this or da, 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 that it's gonna. So tell me about that, because when you said that, I was very intrigued.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. It's not one issue. And I think that that's been a common perception that we have, is that something happens one day and a driver just throws up their hands and is like, I'm out. And that is not the case at all. What usually happens is there's one issue that pushes them over the edge, but there's usually a series of other issues that happen. So this is extremely interesting. So if any issue like this happens in the first 30 days of a driver's tenure, this is the voluntary quit rate. If a driver has a combination of an equipment or an operations problem in the first 30 days, their voluntary quit rate, ready for this? 84.4%.
Ooh. Okay, wait. So you're saying operations and equipment. So like give me like what are the common ones under operations,
Yep.
like a
Communication.
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 Really?
That's the so what this is telling us is, and if my truck is broke down and I'm trying to figure out, do I get breakdown pay? When is my truck going to be ready? What do I need to do? I'm ready to get on my next load. And operations isn't giving them any information, or they're not reaching somebody, or they're just sitting there kind of unknown. When you combine those two, it is,
Bad
pardon the
news.
expression, it's deadly. 84.4%, 84.4.
Wow.
So let's talk compensation. If you have an equipment and a compensation issue combined in the first 30 days, there's a voluntary quit rate of 67.5%. So I think that's pretty, we know what that is. It's an equipment issue, or my truck's in the shop and now I'm not logging miles, or talk about soapboxes, breakdown pay. That's one of my big ones.
Mm-hmm.
Just please hear me, folks. If you say, but they get breakdown pay, I'm sorry, that's crap. And I think I've used this analogy before on one of these, but if any of us are going into the office, we're not drivers, we're going into the office and our computer is broke down and we call IT, we all get paid the same rate if we're at the office, even though our computer is broke down. But drivers, we expect them to do something different. We give them a fraction of their pay. Oh, and by the way, it has to be down usually 24 hours before you give them anything. So I'm sorry. The whole breakdown pay thing to me is like, it's almost insulting when somebody says, well, they got breakdown pay. Well, okay. So let's knock your computer out and
Just
IT has
break
it for
down
a
the
day.
breakdown pay and see
Yeah, yes,
how that
exactly,
works.
exactly.
Yeah.
I so could just spend a whole episode on that, and I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with carriers when a driver's complaining about being broke down multiple times, and their response is always, "Well, he got breakdown pay." Yeah, and
Yeah.
how much? How much was
Listen,
that?
drivers talk about breakdown pay on social media. It's a joke to them. Like,
Well,
yeah.
it is. It is, because it's one of those things that we ask drivers to do that we're not willing to do ourselves. Right. So anyways, sorry, I could totally go off on that. Um, so here's another high one: equipment issue plus home time. So we know this one here. So this is an equipment issue that has affected the driver's home time. Quit rate 63.3%. Going back to orientation training, this is actually the second highest one. Equipment issue with an orientation training. So now we're probably talking about somebody that didn't have a great orientation experience and then got put in a truck that was broke down. Quit rate of 72.7%.
Wow.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that even on the ones that are multiple, that the compensation isn't on every one of them. I just assumed it would be blank and compensation, blank and compensation, and it's not. And that to me, and honestly, the drivers are telling us that even in like our latest driver survey and all the stuff that we, the communications that we have with drivers, they're saying I care about pay. Don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of other things that are really important. And I think for some carriers, they're just like, oh, pay increase. That's the answer to everything. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't make sure that you're not in line in the markets where
100%.
you run, because listen, we have seen a lot of carriers this year that are like, I do not understand, why am I not hiring drivers in, XYZ. Well, let's look at how you compare. Like, you is that's why. Like, it's pretty easy to look at some of it. But the fact that that compensation isn't on all of those dual reasons or whatever you want to call those is interesting to me.
Yeah. I still think at the end of the day, when you look at all of this data, when you look at even the combinations of it, when it happens, I still think it goes back to, yes, drivers would love to have higher pay. We all would love to have higher pay. I still think a lot of this goes back to predictability.
Yeah.
Week after week, what can I expect? And in anything that affects the predictability, And that is obviously when we're talking about compensation, but anything that predicts that, broken down trucks, lack of communication, any of that that's going to affect that predictability is an immediate turnover risk. And the data tells us that. And the great thing about what we now have access to, and that the folks that work with us have access to, is we can actually now score this out and we can predict it and we can flag drivers before they become actual turnover. And it goes back to one of our core values that we have here as it relates to turnover is quickly identify and quickly intervene. We have one company. We are now actually able to measure a escalation response. So when we have a driver that's having an issue, we escalate that to the company. Again, going back to the quickly identify, quickly intervene. So we can actually now measure a carrier's response to that escalation. So how quickly do they fix or address an issue? And I can tell you there's one company we're working with right now that is fixing and addressing issues in less than half a day. And I will tell you that they have seen since April to the end of June, 70 less voluntary quits in this particular division in that time frame.
Oh,
They've gone
wow.
down that much. And it's not all because of what we've been able to do for them. It's because they actually take the information and they do something about it. So they're preventing some of this turnover. It's happening because they know it's there and they actually do something about it.
Yeah,
So
that's
it is
impressive.
becoming effective. So anyway, so let me just kind of sum this up a little bit, just maybe from the recruiting side. What are some of your biggest takeaways from this? Because I want people to understand that this is not just a retention. You're right. There is definitely recruiting aspects to this.
Yes, I think the honest recruiting. I think some fleets, I mean, I would just challenge carriers to sit down and I would even ask some of your drivers that will tell you the real deal and just say, hey, this is how we're selling driving at our carrier. Does this match your experience? And you've got to be real honest with yourself so you can be real honest with the drivers that you're recruiting. So I think the whole honesty part of it is huge. And I know no one's intention is to not be honest. But at the end of the day, we also want to fill trucks. And so I think that, honest recruiting, really being able to manage is the experience I'm selling, the experience that I'm delivering, and making sure that the expectations that you're setting are in alignment with what you're actually delivering. And then honestly, and like I said earlier, I think we're getting better at this, but just having conversations within your fleet that this is not just a recruiting issue or an operations issue. I will tell you, one of the things as you're talking through all of this, I'm literally sitting here thinking to myself, when fleets are having these conversations about retention, there's a lot of times, Scott, that no one is in the room that touches equipment. I mean, if when I think about it, if even a retention committee or a whatever, most of the time those are operations folks, probably fleet managers, maybe some people from the customer service side of the house, because where detention or stuff that happens at the shipper comes into play. And recruiting, it's normally recruiting, operations, maybe somebody from sales and customer service, and safety probably is in the room. But there's a lot of times no one from maintenance or equipment is even there. And literally, half of what you said today touched on that. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that's another good takeaway and a good call out is to be sure you've got someone in the room and in the conversations about retention that represent that side of your fleet that touches equipment.
Yep, that's a great call out. Equipment issues by themselves are not a major driver of turnover, but when equipment issues are combined with others, and most of the time they are, let's just face
Yeah.
it, most of the
Yeah.
time they are. And I will tell you, the companies that we work with that have been the most successful, to your point, and I'm so glad you mentioned this, their maintenance folks, their equipment folks have a seat at the table. They're on
Mhm.
every data call that we do with them. They're on every report that we send them. And they want to know truck numbers. Like, do we have a truck that's constantly in the shop? And we're able to provide that for them. You're spot on. And I'll be honest with you, I hadn't even thought of that either, but you're exactly right. And the places that are the most successful that we work with at reducing, the equipment people are always on the phone in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really mine. Man, Scott, this is good stuff. I'm sitting here thinking, I know we're getting ready to release some of our quarterly data and stuff, and I just want to make sure that we're incorporating some of this into that, because this is great information that carriers can take. And I mean, obviously we want them to work with you guys, but even if they're not, just some good industry data to have, for sure. So is there anything we didn't cover on all of that you would want to make sure we cover?
This would be like a 3-hour podcast if I went through everything. I wanted to make sure we hit the top points, and I think we did that. But I would just tell folks, you got to have visibility right now. In particular, capacity. We know what capacity is doing. Rates are starting to rise. We know companies are now raising pay. I just know what it's been like here at PDA for the last couple of weeks. It's getting somewhat chaotic, which is great, but you got to have visibility into your driver workforce if you're going to effectively, look at reducing turnover. You don't make decisions within your company without visibility. Go ask your CFO if they're making any decisions without visibility into the financial health of the carrier. Go ask your maintenance people if they're purchasing new equipment without having visibility on the current fleet when it comes to the condition of it. And that should be the same about drivers. Don't make decisions that you think drivers want. You need to be making decisions based on what you know they want. And you only do that by having visibility to your fleet.
Yeah. Yeah. Agree. Well, this was great information, Scott. We're gonna have to keep doing this at least a couple times a year to see kind of how all this stuff is trending. This is great. So thanks everybody for listening. If you enjoyed this data and it was something that you feel like you could take back to your teams, please make sure and give us a virtual high five by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. And be sure to hit that subscribe or follow button so you never miss an episode.
And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us on social media, or you can drop us an email, and all of those details are in the notes below. And we'll be back next time with more data, insights, and a little fun to help you ace your recruiting and retention game. Everybody have a great day, and we will see you next month.